The courtroom felt more like a hospital waiting room than a place of justice-stiff chairs, hushed voices, and a silence thick with unspoken emotions. A clock ticked louder than it should have. The buzz of fluorescent lights hummed overhead. Everyone was waiting, not for a verdict, but for a miracle. 9-year-old Emma sat in the front row, her legs dangling off the chair, not quite reaching the floor. Her arms were wrapped tightly around Ranger, a stoic German Shepherd therapy dog, sitting obediently at her feet. His thick fur was slightly ruffled from Emma's grip, but the dog didn't move an inch. His eyes scanned the room like a seasoned soldier, alert, protective, and ready. She hadn't said a single word since being brought into the foster system 5 months ago. Not to the social workers, not to the counselors, not even to her foster mother, Margaret. She didn't scream, didn't cry, didn't smile. Just silence. But when Ranger was first introduced to her, something changed. She didn't speak, not yet, but she touched him. She allowed his warm head to rest on her lap. A week later, she began responding with tiny hand signals. Ranger had been trained to understand. Today's hearing was supposed to be routine, a progress check. Emma's biological father had petitioned for custody. On paper, he looked eligible. Clean background, stable job, no convictions. But paper doesn't always reflect truth. Everyone in the courtroom hoped Emma would say something, anything to help the judge make the right decision. Judge Carlton, a seasoned man in his 60s with kind eyes and a stern jawline, sat behind the bench flipping through documents. He sighed occasionally, glancing up at Emma with concern. "Miss Emma," he said gently, "do you feel comfortable speaking today?" Just a yes or no? No reply. Not even a blink. Her court-appointed guardian shifted uncomfortably in her seat. "She may not be ready," she whispered. "Maybe next time." Then it happened. Emma moved her right hand, slowly and deliberately, toward Ranger. Her fingers curled in a peculiar way, like a secret gesture. Ranger's ears perked up, his head lifting slightly. He stood, turned away from Emma, and trotted straight to the judge's bench. His movement was slow, but deliberate. When he reached the bench, he sat, staring directly at Judge Carlton. Murmurs erupted behind the rows of chairs. "What's he doing?" someone asked. "Is that part of his training?" Another whispered. The judge leaned back in surprise, then looked down at the large dog now staring into his soul. He chuckled nervously. "Well, this is different." Margaret, Emma's foster mother, stood up calmly. "Your Hunter," she said respectfully. "That's the signal. The one Emma gives when she remembers something bad." The entire courtroom froze. The dog's trained to go to the nearest authority figure if she makes that motion, Margaret explained, her voice steady but filled with emotion. "It's not a trick. She's trying to tell us something." The bailiff instinctively stepped forward, unsure whether to intervene. The judge held up his hand to stop him. Judge Carlton studied Ranger for a moment, then shifted his eyes back to Emma. She hadn't moved. She was still hugging herself, her gaze locked on her dog, as if willing him to carry her unspoken words. "I see," he said slowly, turning to the court reporter. "Let the record show that the minor used a known signal toward her therapy dog, resulting in a direct, trained behavioral response." He set the papers aside. "I'm suspending this hearing immediately. I want a child trauma specialist brought in. And I'd like to speak with Miss Emma privately, with Ranger present." No objections came. No one dared. Something had shifted in that moment, not in the law, but in the air. Everyone in that room knew the truth was no longer buried. It had found its way to the surface, not through words, but through a signal and a dog who understood exactly what it meant. Judge Carlton sat in stunned silence, his gavel resting forgotten on the bench. Ranger still sat calmly at his feet, unmoving, as if awaiting further instruction. The courtroom had gone from routine procedure to something that felt sacred, something none of them had seen before. Emma remained in her seat, motionless, but breathing harder now. Her small hand reached down and gently tapped her leg another. Familiar signal Ranger had been trained to respond to. The dog rose, walked back to her side, and settled again with his head on her knees. Only then did she release a deep, shaky breath. The judge leaned forward, speaking not as a figure of authority, but as a man trying to understand something far beyond procedure. "How long has she been using these signals?" he asked, his voice quieter now. Margaret stepped forward again. "About 2 months after she came into my care. She didn't want to talk, not even to me. Then she started watching Ranger howl. He listened. It's like she figured out he was safe before she ever thought I was." The court-appointed guardian nodded in agreement. "We've never seen anything like it. The dog doesn't just comfort her, he interprets her. She trained him in reverse, in a way. Her emotions became his commands." Judge Carlton tapped his fingers on the bench slowly, weighing the gravity of the moment. "And the signal she used just now, what does it mean?" Margaret took a deep breath. "It means she remembers something bad. It's the one she uses when her nightmares are strong, or when she hears something that triggers her." Silence returned to the courtroom. The judge's eyes flicked to Emma. Again still silent, still gripping her protector. But something had changed in her posture. She looked more aware, as if signaling had released a part of her she'd been keeping hidden. Carlton turned to the bailiff. "Clear the courtroom. I want all non-essential personnel out. Contact Dr. Evelyn Sharp. She's on the court's trauma response list." As murmurs of movement stirred the room, lawyers and observers quietly collected their things and exited, still whispering about what they had witnessed. Emma never looked up. She stayed curled beside Ranger, her hair partly covering her face, her world small but guarded. 15 minutes later, Dr. Sharp arrived. A woman in her 40s with kind eyes and a calming presence. She moved straight to Emma's side without hesitation. She didn't ask for introductions. She simply knelt beside the girl and said softly, "You're safe here." Emma didn't answer, but her fingers tightened slightly on Ranger's collar. The judge remained in the room, but retreated to a corner, giving the psychologist space. Margaret sat in the opposite corner, hands clasped nervously. Everyone watched as Ranger shifted, slightly laying his paw on Emma's shoe. A small sign he was ready if she was. Dr. Sharp opened her bag and pulled out a small notebook. "I'm not here to make you talk," she said gently. "But if there's anything you want to tell me through Ranger or drawing or anything, I'm here to listen." For a few minutes, nothing happened. Emma's breathing was slow but steady. Then she reached for the notebook. She didn't write. She drew dot first. She sketched a small girl, then a large dog, then a house one half of it covered in darkness. She drew a man with angry eyebrows, flames, a locked door, and finally tiny lines like sound waves leading from her hand to the dog. Dr. Sharp gently took the notebook and studied the images, her face tightening. "I understand," she whispered. Judge Carlton stood, his voice firm now. "Proceedings are suspended until further notice. Place her under protective custody, and no further contact from her father until this is fully investigated." Ranger, ever silent, laid his head once more in Emma's lap. The courtroom was empty now, but everything important had just been spoken without a single word. For the next few days, the courthouse hallways buzzed with whispers. Staff members traded cautious glances and silent nods, as if reluctant to disturb the memory of what had happened in courtroom 3. Everyone had seen something powerful, a moment when justice paused and humanity took over. But outside that courtroom, the story was just beginning. Emma remained under close supervision, in a protected facility designed for vulnerable children. But unlike many others, she didn't need to be coaxed to cooperate. As long as Ranger was with her, she showed no resistance. In fact, she became almost responsive. Margaret stayed close, visiting her every day and bringing Ranger his favorite treats. He was no longer just a therapy dog. He had become a translator, a guardian, and in many ways, a witness. But perhaps most remarkably, he had become Emma's voice. Dr. Evelyn Sharp began conducting daily sessions with Emma in a small, warm room filled with soft toys and colored pencils. They sat on the floor together, with Ranger lying between them. Like a bridge, Emma never spoke. But she didn't need to not entirely. Instead, she used a blend of gestures, drawings, and touch. One day, she drew a picture of a closet inside it, a sad face. Another day, she handed Evelyn a crayon, then took it back and circled Ranger's tail with it, pointing at the judge's bench. These fragments, disconnected at first, slowly started forming a picture. By the end of the week, Evelyn had compiled enough from the sessions to draft a formal report. Her conclusion was clear. Emma had suffered psychological trauma consistent with long-term exposure to emotional abuse, intimidation, and possibly confinement. The language Emma lacked was compensated by Ranger's presence, which gave her both courage and structure to release her memories in small, meaningful ways. Back in the courthouse, Judge Carlton studied Evelyn's report for the third time, his brow furrowed in concern. It was one thing to hear suspicion. It was another to see it mapped out in the sketches of a child. The moment that sealed his resolve came when he turned the final page of the file. There, attached with a paperclip, was Emma's latest drawing. She had drawn a girl with brown hair standing in front of a house. Behind her, a giant dog stood like a knight, tail stiff, eyes alert. In front of them stood a man, his figure drawn in jagged, sharp lines. The girl in the drawing wasn't afraid. She stood tall, the dog just behind her, forming a wall between her and the man. Carlton set the report down and whispered to himself, "She's telling us everything. And we almost missed it." He scheduled a follow-up hearing close to the public. Only essential personnel allowed. Emma would be present again, with Ranger. Evelyn would testify. And this time, Carlton was determined that no one would leave. The room uncertain about what had truly been happening in Emma's life. On the morning of the hearing, Emma arrived with Margaret and Ranger. Her hair was tied neatly in braids, and for the first time since the beginning of her case, she wore a hint of a smile. Just a flicker, like sunlight breaking through heavy clouds. As they entered the courtroom, Ranger stopped at the door and looked up at Emma. She gave him a small, slow pat on the head. He moved forward confidently, guiding her to the front row. No hesitation. No fear. Carlton watched them take their places, then nodded to the bailiff. "Let's begin." The courtroom was hushed as the judge reviewed his notes. No one dared to break the silence. Not the attorneys, not the clerk, not even the bailiff. Emma sat at the front again, Ranger lying obediently at her feet. She didn't fidget or glance around like most children her age might have. Instead, she gently stroked Ranger's fur, her fingers tracing the same path over and over. It was her comfort, her rhythm, her shield. Dr. Evelyn Sharp took the witness stand. She didn't need to be sworn in again. Everyone in the room already regarded her words with the weight of truth. She adjusted her glasses, glanced at Emma, then began. "In my professional opinion," she said clearly, "Emma exhibits classic symptoms of chronic emotional abuse. While she has not yet verbalized the events fully, her drawings, gestures, and interactions with Ranger provide more than enough behavioral evidence to support that conclusion." The judge nodded slowly. "Can you elaborate on what stood out most during your sessions?" "Yes, Your Honor," Evelyn replied. Emma repeatedly depicts being alone in enclosed spaces, specifically a closet. She draws her father's face with exaggerated angry features, and always separates herself from him using either furniture or her dog. She has also consistently associated Ranger with protection and safety. He's not just a companion. He's her emotional translator. Emma listened quietly, head slightly bowed, but her fingers never stopped moving across Ranger's fur. The judge turned to the lead investigator present. Has any of this been corroborated? Detective Laura Simmons stood up. It has, Your Honor. We revisited Emma's former home and discovered a crawl space inside a bedroom closet. It was padlocked from the outside. The father claimed it was for storage. But inside, we found drawings very similar to the ones Dr. Sharp mentioned. Crayons, a blanket, and a worn stuffed animal were inside. Gasps filled the room. One of the jurors, though not seated for a criminal trial, covered his mouth in shock. Even the father's attorney looked momentarily shaken. The judge remained composed, but his jaw tightened. Was there any prior indication of this in her file? Detective Simmons hesitated. There was a CPS report filed 2 years ago by a neighbor who heard crying, but it was closed without follow-up. The child was too frightened to speak, and the father cooperated fully. No physical injuries were observed at the time. The courtroom fell into a chilling quiet. It was becoming clear how much had been missed. Emma reached into the small satchel on her lap and pulled out a drawing. Without a word, she passed it to Margaret, who in turn handed it to the bailiff. The judge received it next. He studied the page for several long moments. It showed a girl inside a small dark box with a single light bulb above her head. A door was drawn with a keyhole and a lock. But outside the box stood Ranger, nose against the door, a golden key hanging from his mouth. The judge looked up at Emma, his expression unreadable. Then he turned to the record. Let it be entered that the minor voluntarily submitted this image in support of today's testimony. Ranger let out a quiet breath, as if he too had felt the weight lifted. The father's lawyer requested a recess. The judge refused. We're not delaying truth any longer. Evelyn leaned toward the microphone once more. She may never say it out loud, Your Honor, but everything she's told us, through Ranger, through art, and through behavior, screams one thing: she was terrified. And now, she's asking to be heard. The judge looked over at Emma once. Again. This time she raised her eyes and met his gaze. For the first time in the entire process, she nodded. Not a big gesture. Just a small, brave nod. It was all the courtroom needed to move forward. What followed would redefine how the legal system viewed children, therapy animals, and the unspoken weight of silence. Emma didn't need to shout or scream. She didn't need to testify like an adult. She had Ranger, and that was enough. On the morning of the final custody hearing, the courthouse felt different. The usual rigid routines of legal formality were still in place. Suits were pressed, papers stacked neatly, security posted at the entrance, but there was a tension in the air. A kind of reverent stillness, like something larger than the law was about to unfold. People who normally wouldn't give family court a second glance were paying attention now. Rumors had spread beyond the building. A local news station had caught wind of the girl and the dog who stopped a courtroom. And though Judge Carlton had barred public access to the proceedings, curiosity couldn't be contained. Inside, the courtroom was already filled with essential personnel, attorneys, child advocates, and court staff. Everyone had been carefully screened, and the judge had made it explicitly clear. Today's focus was not on legal tactics, it was on truth. Emma walked in slowly, Ranger at her side. She wore a navy blue dress with white trim, her braids tied neatly with matching ribbons. Her foster mother, Margaret, walked just behind her, hands gently placed on Emma's shoulders, as if guiding her with more emotion than touch. Ranger walked with quiet confidence. His gait was smooth, his eyes focused ahead, and his steps led Emma directly to the seat at the front. It was the third time he'd walked her into this room, but today, his presence felt even more commanding. On his collar, someone had attached a small silver pin, a gift from the court staff that read, "Justice's Companion." Judge Carlton entered, his expression serious, but softened by something resembling hope. As he took his place, the room rose in respect, then settled again into attentive silence. "Before we begin," he said slowly, "I'd like to acknowledge the extraordinary courage displayed by this child and the role her service dog has played in allowing us to hear a truth we might have missed." He turned to Emma. "Miss Emma, I know speaking has not been easy, but if you are comfortable today, we'd like to hear anything you wish to share." Emma looked down at Ranger. Then she reached for his ear, gently rubbing the fur like she always did when she was about to give a command. She lifted her fingers and made the same motion she'd used that first day, a strange, curved signal that only Ranger understood. Ranger stood, walked forward 3 slow steps toward the judge, and sat down just like before. The room froze, just like before, but this time Emma rose to her feet. Everyone turned to look at her with her hand resting on Ranger's back. She spoke. Her voice was quiet, barely louder than a whisper, but it carried across the entire room. "He didn't hit me. Not like that," she began. "But he made me scared all the time. He would lock me away when I cried. He said no one would believe me if I told, that no one could hear me. But Ranger heard me." Gasps broke through the silence. Margaret placed a hand over her mouth. One of the attorneys lowered his head. Emma continued. "He said if I told anyone, I'd lose everything. But Ranger didn't leave. Even when I couldn't talk. He understood." She sat down slowly, her breath shaky. Ranger immediately nestled close to her, placing his head on her lap once more. Carlton leaned forward, his eyes slightly glistening. "Thank you, Emma. What you just did, it matters, and it won't be ignored." He turned to the court. "I will issue my ruling tomorrow, but let it be known that this court recognizes the child's testimony as clear and voluntary, supported by corroborating evidence and expert analysis." He paused, eyes falling to Ranger. "And let it also be known that this court acknowledges the contribution of a therapy dog whose presence allowed a child's voice to be heard." The courtroom didn't applaud. No one wanted to disturb the moment, but the energy in the room had changed. It wasn't just a hearing anymore. It was a declaration. Silence would no longer win. The next day, the courtroom was silent again, but the silence now felt different. It was no longer filled with tension, but with anticipation, a collective holding of breath. Everyone who had witnessed Emma speak knew they'd seen something extraordinary. And now, they were waiting for the ruling that would either honor that bravery or erase it. Judge Carlton entered with a document in hand, his written decision. His expression was composed but solemn. He didn't sit immediately. Instead, he looked over the room and then directly at Emma, who sat again with Ranger's chin resting on her knee. "This court has carefully reviewed the testimony provided by the minor, the psychological assessments, the investigative findings, and all supporting evidence," he began. What emerged was not only a clear picture of long-standing emotional abuse, but a portrait of resilience and bravery that defies age. Emma looked down, her fingers curling gently through Ranger's thick fur. She didn't need to look up. She was listening. The judge continued, his voice firm. "Effective immediately, all parental rights of Mr. Robert Talcott are terminated. Full guardianship and custody of the minor, Emma Grace Talcott, are hereby granted to her current foster guardian, Margaret Holloway, with intent to adopt pending standard approval." A collective exhale passed through the courtroom. Margaret squeezed Emma's shoulder. Ranger's ears twitched, but the judge wasn't finished. He placed the document on the bench, folded his hands, and looked toward the official court reporter. I also wish to formally enter a supplemental statement for the record. This court acknowledges the unprecedented role played by the therapy dog, Ranger. His responsiveness to the minor's trauma. Cues enabled the surfacing of critical testimony. His presence acted as a bridge between silence and truth. The room sat in stunned stillness. It is the opinion of this court, he said slowly, that therapy animals, when properly trained and managed, can serve as invaluable support in child welfare cases. Therefore, I am recommending to the state Judicial Board the development of new guidelines for integrating certified trauma dogs into appropriate court proceedings involving vulnerable minors. Heads turned, eyes widened. This wasn't just a victory for Emma. It was a shift in policy. The judge wasn't just ruling in her favor. He was changing how the system saw children like her. Emma looked up now, her eyes locking with the judge's. She gave the same small nod as before. This time, it held confidence. After court adjourned, something unexpected happened. Judge Carlton stepped down from the bench and walked directly to Emma and Ranger. He bent down slightly, placing one hand gently on the dog's head. I've seen a lot of cases, he said quietly, but none like this. You gave her a voice when the rest of us couldn't. Thank you. Ranger didn't move. He didn't need to. His answer was in his steady gaze. Margaret knelt beside Emma, beaming with quiet pride. We always knew he was special. Now the world does too. Outside, word spread like wildfire. By that evening, news stations across the state had picked up the story. Therapy dog helps girl break silence in courtroom. One headline read. Another called it, The Day the Dog Changed the Law. Legal blogs dissected the implications. Mental health organizations celebrated the recognition. And in one humble home, Emma sat on the floor with Ranger beside her, drawing yet another picture, this time of a girl standing in front of a courthouse, holding a leash with a gold medal. Around her dog's neck, in her eyes. Justice hadn't just been served, it had listened. In the weeks following the judge's ruling, Emma's story began to spread far beyond her small town. What began as a quiet custody case had turned into a national conversation. News anchors highlighted the moment Ranger walked to the judge. Articles detailed the silent signals, the courtroom gasps, and the drawing of the closet with the golden key. But more than that, the world was now focused on something rare-hope. Emma and Ranger became the face of something bigger, the power of nonverbal expression, the healing bond between children and animals, and the cracks in a system too often blind to subtle cries for help. The media coverage grew quickly. Local stations aired footage of Margaret and Emma walking Ranger through a sunny park, his tail wagging and Emma's smile cautious but growing stronger. A morning show segment called Ranger's Voice drew millions of views. Emails poured in from families, therapists, and even former foster children saying they had felt voiceless once too, and now they felt seen. Margaret, always gentle and composed, received an invitation to speak at a state child welfare conference. At first, she declined public attention, was the last thing she wanted for Emma. But when she showed Emma the letter, the girl simply said, "Can Ranger come too?" And so, 1 month after the hearing, Emma, Margaret, and Ranger took the stage. Together at the annual Voices for the Vulnerable Summit, the crowd of professional social workers, judges, and therapists rose in applause before they even spoke. Emma held Ranger's leash tightly, a blue ribbon now tied neatly around his collar. He sat proudly beside her, head high, as if he understood his role in all this. Margaret did the talking. She spoke about trauma, healing, and the moment Emma had first signaled Ranger in court. She described the days Emma wouldn't speak at all, and how one dog with quiet eyes and patience, beyond understanding, had opened a door no human could. Then she stepped aside. Emma walked up to the microphone. Her hands shook. Ranger nudged her leg, grounding her. She took a breath. "I couldn't say what happened to me," she said. "I didn't have the words." But Ranger understood. He always knew. He was like my translator. He helped me remember I wasn't alone. The audience, many of whom worked in trauma and had seen unimaginable things, had tears in their eyes. Afterward, dozens of people approached them. A judge asked for information about therapy dog programs. A therapist offered to volunteer time with families who had nonverbal children. A state senator whispered to Margaret, "This changes everything." In the following months, something incredible happened. Laws began to shift. Inspired by Emma's case, 2 other states introduced pilot programs allowing certified therapy. Dogs to support minors during court appearances. Judges began requesting training on child-sensitive testimony techniques. One law firm even partnered with local shelters to train rescue dogs as court comfort animals. Emma and Ranger had started a movement. Back at home, life found a new rhythm. Emma officially became Margaret's adopted daughter. They had movie nights, school lunches, and long walks. Ranger became a local celebrity, featured in a mural painted near the elementary school entrance with the words, "He listened when no one else did." But for Emma, fame meant little. What mattered was that other kids like her might now be heard. She began sketching a children's book about Ranger, how he learned her signs, how he sat by her in court, how he never left. She called it The Dog That Understood. Every day she lived a little louder, not because she had to speak, but because now she knew that when someone listens with love, silence doesn't mean invisibility. 1 year later, Emma sat on a grassy hill in the park, drawing quietly as the afternoon breeze danced through her hair. At her side, Ranger lay stretched out in the sun, his head resting on his paws, eyes half closed, but ears still alert. He was older now, a little grayer around the muzzle, but still strong, still watching over her, like he always had. The past 12 months had changed everything. Emma was officially adopted. Her name had been legally changed to Emma Grace Holloway. The paperwork had been signed in the same courtroom where she had once struggled to lift her voice. But this time, it wasn't silence or fear that filled the room. It was laughter, hugs, and tears of joy. Judge Carlton had presided again, smiling, as he handed Emma a small stuffed gavel as a keepsake. "You've taught this courtroom more than any adult ever could," he told her that day, "and we'll never forget it." Ranger had worn a red bow tie for the occasion. Since then, Emma had begun attending school full-time. She still carried a small notepad with her and communicated through sketches when she didn't feel ready to speak. But her classmates accepted her quickly. They loved Ranger, who sometimes waited outside during school hours, and who was now officially designated as her service animal. Not just a therapy dog. At home, Margaret transformed the spare room into an art studio for Emma. The walls were covered. In her colorful drawings, some of Ranger, some of herself, and many of them both together. They were no longer hiding in closets or behind locked doors. They stood in open fields, on mountains, even flying through the sky with superhero capes. But perhaps the most powerful transformation came when Emma decided to help others. With the support of Margaret and Dr. Sharp, she launched a program called Ranger's Voice, a nonprofit that trained rescue dogs to serve as courtroom companions for traumatized children. The organization also provided art kits and drawing sessions for kids in foster care or shelters. Emma didn't want any child to feel invisible again, and she made sure each dog was trained to recognize the signals, the same silent language she had created with Ranger. One sunny Saturday, Emma and Margaret were invited to a courthouse in a neighboring state. A little boy named Liam, age 6, was preparing to testify in a neglect case. He hadn't spoken in months. Emma brought Ranger with her. Liam sat in the quiet waiting room, fidgeting with his shirt, eyes locked on the floor. When Ranger walked in, tail swaying gently, Liam looked up. At first, he didn't move. Then Emma knelt beside him, handed him a pencil and paper, and sat quietly. No pressure. No questions. Liam drew a picture of a house with no windows. Emma nodded and smiled. Then she handed him her old notebook, the one she had filled during our first months in foster care. Inside the front cover, she had written only one line: "You're not alone anymore." That day, Liam gave a statement with Ranger by his side. And though it was just a few words, they were enough. That night, back at home, Emma curled up in bed with Ranger at her feet. She looked out the window at the stars. A year ago, her world had felt like a dark, locked box. Now it was wide open, safe, free. She reached down, rubbed Ranger's head, and whispered, "We did it, boy." He gave a low, contented sigh, nuzzled closer, and closed his eyes. And in the silence of that room, there was peace, not because words were spoken, but because finally someone had listened.